Maverick Hunt thought he was the king of the Atlantic. He was wrong. While he celebrated his billion-dollar empire, I was busy turning off the lights. Now, his floating city is just a cage of glass and steel. And I am the one who holds the key. They called Symphony Black a relic of a dead era. Maverick laughed as he had his security throw me into a lifeboat. He told the world that in international waters, there are no laws. He thought his wealth made him untouchable. He didn't realize that I don't just study the law. I own the ground it is built on, as I rolled my antique bone-carved chess queen between my fingers. I watched him drop his anchor. That was his final mistake. Maverick thought the ocean floor was a free-for-all. But a 200-year-old Maritime? Treaty says that seabed belongs to me. By the time his censors realized the ground was private property, I had already locked his anchor's dot in the next few minutes. You will see how a single chess piece can sink a tech giant. This is not a story of revenge. It is a lesson in absolute sovereignty. Pay attention. Because when the anchor drops, the bill comes due. The sky over the Atlantic did not just turn black. It turned a bruised, violent shade of indigo, a color that matched the depths of the water below. Inside the grand observation deck of the Aegis, the air was pressurized, artificial. It smelled of expensive cedar wood and the faint, metallic temps of high-end electronics. The storm outside was a world-ending event. But inside, the elite were sipping vintage cognac and laughing at the fury of nature. At the center of the room stood Maverick Hunt. He was wearing a suit made of crushed velvet that cost more than a small country's annual budget. He moved with the heavy, unearned confidence of a man who believed the world was his. Playground Dot, standing across from him, was Symphony Black Dot. Her skin was a deep, polished blue-black that seemed to absorb the dim light of the room. Her silver-gray buzzcut caught the flicker of the lightning through the floor-to-ceiling glass. The shaved wave pattern on her temple was a sharp, geometric reminder of her precision. Symphony did not move. She did not blink. Between her fingers, she rolled her antique bone-carved chess queen. The texture of the aged bone was cool against her skin. It felt like history. It felt like power. To anyone else, it was a trinket. To Symphony, it was a sovereign key. Maverick Hunt laughed. The sound was sharp, grating, like glass breaking over marble. He leaned forward, his breath smelling of aged peat and arrogance. He told her that her presence was an insult to his vision. He pointed a finger at the map on the table, a map of the open sea. He told her that out here, there are no flags, there are no kings, and there are certainly no laws written by dead men on dusty parchment. He called her a ghost, a relic of an era where borders meant something. He told her that the Aegis was a sovereign nation of his own making. Built by silicon and steel. Symphony felt the weight of the Bone Queen in her palm. She felt the pulse in her thumb, steady, low. She was not thinking about his insults. She was thinking about the United Nations, its Convention on the Law of the Sea. She was thinking about Article 76, the definition of the continental shelf. She looked at Maverick. Her amber eyes were like two lanterns in the dark. She told him that the ocean is not a void. It is a ledger. Every inch of the seabed has a name attached to it. Every grain of sand has a price. Maverick's face twisted, the arrogance replaced by a sudden, sharp flash of rage. He didn't want to hear about deeds. He didn't want to hear about the ground miles beneath his feet. He believed he was flying. He snapped his fingers. 4 security guards moved in. They were massive, professional. Their gear was matte black. Their faces were stone. They surrounded Symphony like a wall of iron. Maverick stepped closer. His voice was a whisper now, cold, mean. He told her that he was tired of her imaginary laws. He told her that since she loved the sea so much, she should spend some quality time with it. He ordered them to take her. Not to her ship. Not to the Obsidian. He ordered them to put her in a lifeboat. Symphony did not struggle. She did not cry out. She allowed the guards to grip her arms. Their hands were heavy, violent, but she remained centered. She felt the cold metal of the door as they dragged her toward the loading bay. The transition from the luxury of the deck to the raw, primal force of the storm was instantaneous. The wind hit her like a physical blow. It was a screaming, salty entity that tried to tear the breath from her lungs. The rain was not water. It was needles, cold, sharp, constant. The loading bay of the Aegis hissed open. Below them, the Atlantic was a churning, white-capped nightmare. The waves were mountains of liquid obsidian, rising and falling with a terrifying, rhythmic power. The guards shoved her into the orange plastic shell of the lifeboat. It felt flimsy, pathetic against the scale of the storm. One of the guards looked at her. There was a flicker of something like pity in his eyes, but he pulled the lever anyway. The lifeboat dropped. The sensation of falling was a void in her stomach. Then, the impact. The boat slammed into the water with a bone-jarring thud. For a second, everything was white foam and darkness. The lifeboat groaned, the plastic walls vibrating against the pressure of the deep. Symphony sat in the center of the small, swaying vessel. The rain soaked through her silk suit in seconds. The silver gray of her hair turned dark. She reached into her pocket. Her fingers found the bone-carved queen. She held it tight. She felt the micro-vibrations of the storm traveling through the boat, through the water, through the seabed high above her. The Aegis glowed, a golden, defiant island of light in the middle of the chaos. Maverick Hunt was probably back in the observation deck, toasting to his victory. He thought he had discarded a nuisance. Symphony closed her eyes. She leaned back against the hard plastic. She began to count. She wasn't counting the seconds until she died. She was counting the nautical miles. She was calculating the exact point where Maverick's anchors hit the floor. He thought she was a victim of the storm. He didn't realize she was the storm. She felt the lifeboat rise on the crest of a massive wave. At the peak, she could see the horizon, empty, dark, deadly. She touched the Bone Queen to her lips. The humiliation was a gift. It was the final piece of evidence she needed by throwing her into the sea. Maverick Hunt had just committed an act of maritime abandonment. He had broken the very laws he claimed didn't exist. Symphony smiled. It was a cold, sharp expression that did not reach her eyes. She knew something Maverick didn't. The Obsidian was not just a research vessel. It was a predator, and it was already closing in. She felt the boat drop again, into the trough of the wave, into the silence of the dark. She waited. She was Symphony Black, and she was the only person on this planet who knew exactly who owned the ground Maverick Hunt was standing on. The bill was coming, and it was going to be more than he could ever pay. The metal grating of the loading bay was cold. It was a brutal, industrial contrast to the velvet and silk of the upper decks. Symphony Black stood at the precipice of the abyss. The Atlantic was screaming below her, a violent, churning cauldron of salt and rage. The air here did not smell like expensive cedar wood. It smelled of raw ozone, of rusted iron, of the impending death of a titan. The security guards held her arms with a grip meant to intimidate. They wanted to feel her pulse jump. They wanted to hear her breath catch. They wanted a sign of human fear. They found nothing. Symphony's pulse was a steady, low rhythm. It was the frequency of the deep ocean. Her blue-black skin was slick with the salt spray. Her silver-gray buzzcut shimmered under the harsh industrial floodlights. The wave pattern on her temple seemed to move with the rhythm of the storm. She was not a prisoner being exiled. She was a sovereign conducting a site inspection. Maverick Hunt stood 10 feet back, safely behind the line of the pressurized seal. He was smiling. It was the smile of a man who thought he had one. He believed that by removing the observer, he could erase the observation. He believed that the law ended where his eyesight did. He called out over the roar of the wind. He told Symphony that the ocean had no memory. He told her that in 10 minutes, the water would close over her wake, and his empire would continue to rise. Symphony looked at him, not with anger, but with a cold, clinical pity. She knew the truth about the Aegis. It was a $5 billion monument to hubris. It was a data haven, a floating casino, a tax-free sanctuary for the world's most arrogant elite. Maverick called it a sovereign nation. Symphony called it a floating trespass between her fingers. She rolled the antique, bone-carved chess queen. She felt the micro-engravings on the base. These were not just decorations. They were coordinates. They were the encrypted keys to a series of maritime deeds that predated Maverick's family tree by 3 generations. The bone-carved queen was warm from her skin. It felt like a living thing. A talisman of institutional justice. The guards began to shove her toward the edge, toward the orange plastic shell of the lifeboat that bobbed like a child's toy in the dark. But Symphony stopped. She planted her feet. Her strength was not physical. It was the strength of a woman who knew exactly where she stood on the map of human history. The guards hesitated. There was something in her posture, a gravity that made the deck feel solid despite the churning sea. Symphony reached into the inner pocket of her soaked silk blazer. The guards flinched. They expected a weapon. They expected a flare. What she pulled out was small, heavy, a matte black cylinder no larger than a fountain pen. This was the silent marker. It was a weighted acoustic beacon, tuned to a frequency that only one ship in the world could hear. The obsidian dot to Maverick Hunt. It looked like a piece of trash, a final, pathetic gesture of a drowning woman. Symphony held the marker up. The light from the Aegis reflected off its polished surface. She looked past the guards, directly into Maverick's eyes. She told him that every empire has a foundation, and every foundation has a price. She told him that he had built his house on her floor, and the rent was now due. Maverick laughed. He shook his head. He told the guards to finish it as they pushed her back. Symphony opened her hand. The silent marker did not fall. It plummeted. It cut through the air like a needle. It hit the surface of the black water without a splash. It disappeared into the trough of a 15-foot wave. Maverick didn't even see it hit. But Symphony felt the shift. The moment that beacon touched the water, the countdown began. The marker was weighted with depleted uranium. It would sink at a precise rate. It would bypass the thermoclines. It would avoid the sonar nets of the Aegis. In exactly 4 minutes. It would strike the seabed. It would strike a specific coordinate on the mid-Atlantic ridge. A coordinate designated as private property under the 1954 Seabed Mining Act. Symphony's grandfather had not bought land. He had bought the future. He had seen a world where the surface was crowded, and the power moved to the depths. He had secured the mineral rights to a 200-mile stretch of the ocean floor, and he had protected those rights with a ghost trust that was invisible to modern banking. Maverick Hunt had anchored his billion-dollar city directly into the heart of that trust by dropping the marker. Symphony had legally served him in maritime law. Service of process in international waters is a gray zone, unless you can prove the defendant was physically present on the property. Maverick's anchors were his signature. The silent marker was the TIMESTAMP. Symphony felt the guards release her arms as she stepped into the lifeboat. She sat down. The orange plastic was wet and cold. The winch began to groan, the cables unspooling. Dropping her toward the violent white foam of the Atlantic, she looked up at the towering silhouette of the Aegis. It looked like a golden tooth in the mouth of a monster. She could see Maverick Hunt turning away. He was already forgotten her. He was walking back toward the cognac, toward the velvet, toward the lies. Symphony didn't watch him. She watched her watch. The seconds ticked by. 3, 2, 1. Somewhere 5 miles beneath the churning surface, the silent marker struck the silt of the ocean floor. A silent, low-frequency pulse rippled through the water. It was a digital scream, 1,000 miles away. In a hidden cove in the Azores, the Obsidian came to life. The stealth research vessel did not have lights. It had sensors. It did not have a crew. It had a phalanx of maritime lawyers and tactical engineers. The Obsidian received the ping. The coordinates were confirmed. The trespass was recorded, the legal trap was now armed. Symphony felt the lifeboat hit the water. The impact jarred her teeth. The cold spray blinded her for a moment. The cable snapped free. The Aegis began to move away, its massive engines pushing it through the storm. It looked like a city leaving a survivor behind. But Symphony knew the truth. The Aegis wasn't leaving. It was being tethered by anchoring into the seabed, rights held by the Black estate. Maverick Hunt had just granted Symphony Black adverse possession over his utility infrastructure. Every gallon of water he desalinized, every kilowatt of power he generated, every byte of data he sent through his satellite array, it was all flowing through her property. And since he had expelled the owner, he was no longer a resident. He was a pirate. Symphony gripped the sides of the swaying lifeboat. The waves were mountains now. She was a speck of orange in a world of black. But she wasn't afraid. She touched her bone-carved queen. She whispered to the wind. She told the ocean to hold him. The countdown was no longer for her survival. The countdown was for the foreclosure of a kingdom. In 12 hours, the Aegis would realize it was no longer a country. It was a debt. Symphony closed her eyes. She let the storm take her. She knew that out in the dark, the obsidian was already cutting. Through the waves, the silent marker had spoken, and the law of the deep was coming for Maverick Hunt. The institutional machine was moving, cold, precise, absolute. Maverick thought he had thrown her to the sharks. He didn't realize she was the one who fed them. The Aegis was no longer just a ship. In the fevered mind of Maverick Hunt, it was a birthright, a new world born of silicon and titanium. It drifted on the Atlantic like a diamond resting on a bed of black velvet, a $5 billion monument to human arrogance. Tonight, the sky was a bruised indigo, but inside the grand atrium, everything was gold. The air was a masterpiece of climate control. It was chilled to exactly 68 degrees. It smelled of expensive white truffles, of rare vintage champagne, of the ozone from 1,000 high-speed data servers humming in the bowels of the city. There was no salt in the air. Maverick had scrubbed the ocean out of his atmosphere. He wanted his guests to forget they were floating on a liquid grave. He stood on the glass mezzanine, looking down at the collection of billionaires and power brokers he had gathered from every corner of the globe. Each one of them was a predator in their own right. But tonight, they were his subjects. They walked on marble floors that had been flown in from Italy. They drank from crystal flutes that cost more than a family car. Maverick Hunt adjusted his crushed velvet lapels. He felt the weight of his own genius. To him, the ocean was not a territory. It was a loophole, a vast, empty space where he could finally build a kingdom without a king. He stepped toward the golden microphone. The chatter died down, leaving only the low, subsonic thrum of the city's massive engines. It was the sound of power. He raised a glass of golden liquid. He smiled. It was the smile of a man who believed he had deleted the concept of consequence. He spoke of the Declaration of Independence. He spoke of the new founder. He told the world's elite that they were no longer bound by the laws of landlocked nations. He told them that the Aegis was its own flag, its own law, its own god. He claimed that because they were in international waters, they were free. The crowd erupted in a refined, cold applause. They believed him. They wanted to believe that their wealth had finally purchased them a seat outside of history, 40 miles away, in the heart of a stealth research vessel named the Obsidian. Symphony Black was watching. She sat in a chair of matte black leather. Her posture was perfect, a pillar of calm in a room filled with flickering monitors and data streams. The bridge of the Obsidian was silent, except for the rhythmic, soft ping of the sonar. Symphony's skin was a deep, polished blue-black. It seemed to catch the blue light of the screens, turning her into a shadow-given form. Her silver-gray buzz cut was a sharp, geometric contrast against the dark. The shaved wave pattern on her temple caught the light as she tilted her head between her fingers. She rolled the antique bone-carved chess queen, The bone was cool. It felt heavy. It was a physical anchor in a world of digital lies. Symphony wasn't looking at the golden party. She was looking at the subsurface maps. She was looking at the infrared heat. Signatures of Maverick's anchors. The anchors were buried deep in the silt of the mid-Atlantic ridge. They were massive. 300-ton claws of steel. Clinging to the earth to Maverick, the anchors were just stability. To Symphony, they were the evidence of a crime. She watched the data pings from the silent marker. The beacon she had dropped was still screaming its silent message. It was a legal heartbeat. Every pulse confirmed that Maverick Hunt was physically connected to a piece of property he did not own. Symphony felt the cold, analytical satisfaction of a predator who had already closed the trap. She thought about the concept of fiduciary duty. She thought about the ghost trust her grandfather had established in the 1950s. He had been a man who understood that land on the surface would eventually be fought over. But the floor of the deep, that was the last frontier. He had secured the subsurface rights through a series of decommissioned treaties. He had buried the deeds in a shell corporation that sat inside another shell corporation, a Russian nesting doll of legal sovereignty. Maverick Hunt thought he was a pioneer, but he had just built his kingdom on someone else's front porch. Symphony adjusted her grip on the bone-carved queen. She felt the texture of the carvings. These were not just ornaments. They were the physical embodiment of a legal claim that predated the internet itself. She looked at the clock. The countdown was moving. Maverick was down there, proclaiming his freedom. He was signing independence documents that were worth less than the paper they were printed on. Symphony knew the exact moment the tide would turn. In maritime law, specifically under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, a vessel is subject to the laws of its flag state. But the moment a vessel attaches itself to the seabed, it becomes a permanent installation, and permanent installations are subject to the laws of the property owner. By claiming the Aegis was a nation, Maverick had legally severed its status as a ship. He had made it a building. And he had built that building on a private mineral reserve held by the Black estate. Symphony's internal monologue was a cold, high-speed calculation. She wasn't seeking. By claiming the Aegis was a nation, Maverick had legally severed its status as a ship. He had made it a building. And he had built that building on a private mineral reserve held by the Black estate. Symphony's internal monologue was a cold, high-speed calculation. She wasn't seeking revenge for the humiliation of being thrown into the sea. Revenge was emotional. Revenge was messy. This was an asset seizure. This was a foreclosure on a global scale. She watched Maverick Hunt through the high-definition feed. He was laughing. He was shaking hands with the Prime Minister. He was a man at the peak of his power. Symphony felt her pulse jump once, a sharp, brief spark of anticipation. She remembered the salt spray on her face. She remembered the cold metal of the guard's hands. She touched the bone queen to her cheek. It was cold, absolute. She spoke to the empty bridge. Her voice was a low, rich velvet. She told the screen that the party was over. He just didn't know it yet. She signaled her team. The tactical engineers on the Obsidian were ready. They were not wielding guns. They were wielding satellite overrides. Symphony gave the command to activate the grounding protocol. Maverick Hunt had boasted about his city being independent. He had bragged about having his own power, his own data servers, his own water. But his desalinization plants drew water from the currents Symphony controlled. His data servers were grounded into the seabed floor she owned. His very stability was dependent on the soil of the Black Trust. By dropping the anchors, he had legally signed a lease he hadn't read, and the rent was now due in full. Symphony watched as the first outlier ping appeared on the monitor. The power grid in the Aegis was beginning to fluctuate. It was subtle, a flickering of the golden lights in the grand atrium. Maverick paused in his speech. He looked up at the ceiling. A flicker of confusion crossed his face. He dismissed it with a laugh. He told his guests it was just the energy of the new world. Symphony smiled. It wasn't the energy of a new world. It was the sound of a foreclosure being served. She leaned back in her chair. The matte black leather hissed as it took her weight. She rolled the bone-carved queen one last time. The celebration was reaching its peak. The champagne was flowing. The music was a deep, thumping rhythm of triumph. Maverick Hunt was a king. Symphony Black was the architect of his bankruptcy. She watched the golden city on her screen. It looked so fragile. A tiny spark of light in a massive, unforgiving ocean. She knew that in 12 hours, Maverick Hunt would be begging for a lifeboat, and she would be the one holding the oars. The institutional justice machine was now in full motion. There were no cliches here. No physical fights. Just the cold, irreversible weight of the law. Symphony closed her eyes for a second. Listening to the sonar, the ping was constant. Maverick Hunt was trapped in a billion-dollar cage of his own making. And the door was already locked. The grand atrium of the Aegis was a cathedral of light and hubris. Maverick Hunt stood at the center of the mezzanine. He was a god of his own making. Surrounding him was the perfume of success and the heavy scent of ancient, untaxed wealth. The elite of the world were laughing. Their voices were a symphony of entitlement. They believed they were floating in a paradise beyond the reach of terrestrial law. Maverick raised his hand. The golden liquid in his crystal glass caught the shimmering light of the massive chandeliers. He began to speak about a world without borders. He spoke about the dawn of a new era where technology was the only true sovereign. 40 miles away, in the pressurized silence of the bridge on the Obsidian, Symphony Black was listening to every word. The bridge was dark, lit only by the cool blue glow of holographic displays. Symphony sat in her matte black command chair. Her posture was absolute. She was a monument of patience. Her skin was a deep blue-black mahogany. It seemed to absorb the light of the monitors. Her silver-gray buzz cut was sharp. The shaved wave pattern on her temple caught the blue light as she tilted her head. She looked like a queen waiting for a kingdom to fall between her fingers. She rolled the antique bone-carved chess queen. The texture was smooth, worn by decades of history. This was the sovereign key. This was the physical proof of a claim that Maverick Hunt was about to realize he could never defeat. Symphony watched the data feed. The sonar was tracking the movement of the Aegis. It was drifting slowly, pushed by the deep Atlantic currents. To Maverick, this was freedom. To Symphony, this was a violation of international mineral reserves. She looked at the clock on her primary display. The countdown she had started when she dropped the silent marker was reaching 0. She whispered to the silent bridge. She told the ocean to take hold. The instruction was simple. A single command sent via a high-frequency acoustic burst, 5 miles beneath the surface. The seabed clamps were already in position. They were massive. Hydraulic leviathans forged from high-tensile titanium. They were part of a deep-sea mining infrastructure that had been dormant for 40 years. An infrastructure owned by the Black estate. The clamps engaged on the mezzanine of the Aegis. Maverick Hunt was reaching the climax of his speech. He was promising his guests that they would never have to answer to a government again. Then it happened. It was not a sound. It was a sensation, a massive, violent shudder ripped through the billion-ton city. It was as if the earth itself had reached up and grabbed the hull. The crystal chandeliers in the grand atrium did not just sway. They screamed. Thousands of tiny glass shards rained down on the elite like diamonds of ice. The golden liquid in Maverick's glass leaped out, soaking his velvet lapels. He stumbled, his hands clawing at the golden microphone stand as the mezzanine groaned under the stress. The guests screamed. The laughter died instantly, replaced by a raw, primordial terror. The music cut out, replaced by the sound of metal fighting metal. A deep, subsonic groan that vibrated through the very marrow of their bones. The Aegis had not just stopped. It had been grounded. Symphony Black felt the vibration even through the sensors of the obsidian. She closed her eyes for a second, feeling the weight of the victory. She rolled the bone-carved queen across her knuckles. The click of the bone was the only sound in the bridge. Maverick Hunt scrambled to his feet. His face was no longer the mask of a god. It was the face of a frightened boy. He looked around at the chaos. He shouted for his engineers. He demanded to know what they had hit. He didn't understand. There were no reefs here. There were no mountains. They were in the deep blue. He looked at the digital navigation displays. They were flashing red dot. The anchors of the Aegis had been forcibly locked. They were no longer floating. They were tethered to the seabed. The technicality was simple and devastating. Under the Seabed Mining Act of 1954, the moment a vessel makes a permanent, non-consensual attachment to a private mineral reserve, it is no longer a ship. It is an encroachment. Symphony had used the seabed clamps to force Maverick into a legal corner. By locking his anchors, she had physically merged his city with her land in the eyes of international law. The Aegis was now a building on her property and in maritime litigation. Encroachment leads to immediate asset seizure. Symphony leaned forward. Her amber eyes were cold, precise to watch Maverick on the monitor. He was screaming at his security team. He was trying to order them to release the anchors, but he couldn't. The seabed clamps were powered by an independent thermal vent array. They were not using his power. They were using the heat of the earth. They were absolute. Symphony touched her bone-carved queen to her lips. She thought about the concept of fiduciary duty. She thought about her grandfather. He had taught her that the loudest man in the room is usually the one with the most to lose. Maverick Hunt had spent $5 billion to build a lawless city. Symphony Black had spent 50 years maintaining the deeds to the floor. She felt a cold, analytical satisfaction. This was not a fight. This was a foreclosure. The internal monologue in Symphony's mind was a symphony of legal protocols. She was calculating the exact amount of daily damages she could claim for the unauthorized mooring. She was thinking about the maritime liens that were now being automatically filed in every port in the world. The Aegis was dead in the water. Maverick Hunt was a king without a kingdom. He was a trespasser in a velvet suit. Symphony looked at the bridge crew of the Obsidian. She gave a single sharp nod. She told them to begin the satellite override. Now that the city was grounded, its status as a vessel was legally void. This allowed Symphony to trigger a safety zone lockdown under the sovereign deed protocols. She watched as the lights on the Aegis began to flicker again. This time, it wasn't just a fluctuation. It was a shutdown. The elite guests were huddled together in the dark atrium, the only light coming from their expensive smartphones. The scent of white truffles was being replaced by the smell of burning electrical insulation. The groan of the metal was constant now. The city was fighting the tide, but the tide always wins. Symphony adjusted her silver-gray buzz cut with one hand. Her movements were fluid, like a predator moving through the tall grass. She looked at the bone-carved queen in her palm. The light caught the intricate carvings. She felt the weight of the history it represented. She spoke to the air. Her voice was a low, resonant velvet. She told Maverick, through the silent void, that his declaration of independence was over. She told him that he was now a tenant of the Black estate, and his lease had just been terminated. She watched him on the screen. He was leaning against the mezzanine railing, looking out into the dark Atlantic. He looked small. He looked fragile. The institutional justice machine had just closed its jaws. There was no escape. There were no lawyers who could fight a seabed deed. There were no navies that would protect a trespasser. Symphony Black felt the cold, perfect stillness of the bridge. She was the architect of the fall. She was the sovereign of the deep. She watched as the first emergency flares began to rise from the deck of the Aegis. The elite were calling for help, but the only ship close enough to hear them was the Obsidian, and Symphony was not in the business of rescue. She was in the business of repossession. She rolled the bone-carved queen one last time. It made a sharp, decisive click against the armrest of her chair. The grounding was complete. The city was hers. Maverick Hunt was just a ghost in her hallway. The silence that followed the grounding of the Aegis was not a natural silence. It was the heavy, suffocating stillness of a machine that had forgotten how to breathe in the grand atrium. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and the dying perfume of the world's most powerful people. The gold-leafed walls were shadowed. The massive crystal chandeliers were dark. Only the flickering emergency floor lights cast long, jagged shadows across the marble. Maverick Hunt stood in the center of the mezzanine. His velvet suit was stained. His face was a pale mask of disbelief. He was staring at his high-tech console. The devices that once gave him power over the horizon were now nothing more than glass and silicon bricks. The digital heartbeat of his empire had stopped, 40 miles away. Within the matte black hull of the Obsidian, Symphony Black sat in total command. The bridge of her ship was a temple of cold, blue light. The temperature was kept at a precise 65 degrees. It was the temperature of calculation. Symphony felt the chill against her deep, blue-black skin. It was a familiar, comforting cold. She rolled the antique bone-carved chess queen across her knuckles. The click of the bone against her signet ring was a rhythmic, deadly sound. She looked at the carved crown of the queen. It was a symbol of a sovereignty that Maverick Hunt could never buy with his venture capital. Her silver-gray buzz cut caught the flicker of the data streams. The wave pattern on her temple seemed to ripple as she adjusted her focus. Symphony touched a control on her armrest. It was time for the digital deletion. She wasn't just cutting the power. She was invoking the Maritime Interference Protocol. Under international law, a vessel that makes an illegal, non-consensual attachment to a private seabed becomes a navigational hazard. Once Symphony's seabed clamps had locked Maverick's anchors, she had the legal right to signal the International Telecommunication Union. She had reported the Aegis as a rogue installation, an unauthorized interference with sovereign mineral property. The result was a total digital erasure. On the mezzanine, Maverick Hunt watched in horror as his primary satellite array went dark. The status light turned from a confident blue to a terminal, pulsing red dot suddenly. The city lost all satellite connectivity. The high-speed internet that allowed his guests to move billions with a single tap was gone. The encrypted servers that held the secrets of the world's elite were severed from the web. The Aegis was no longer a data haven. It was a black hole. But Symphony was not finished. She gave the command to jam the GPS relays to the rest of the world's maritime tracking systems. The Aegis simply stopped existing. On the digital maps of every navy and every commercial fleet, the icon representing Maverick City flickered once and vanished. Maverick was legally and digitally deleted from the world map. He ran to the edge of the mezzanine. Looking out at the dark Atlantic, he saw nothing. No lights of passing ships. No glow on the horizon. Even the stars seemed to have abandoned him. He was a man who lived through screens. Without them, he was a non-entity. He was a ghost in a velvet suit. Symphony Black watched his panic through the infrared feed. She saw the heat signature of his pulse racing. She saw the jagged movements of a man losing his grip on reality. She felt a cold, analytical satisfaction. This was the moment of digital foreclosure. She thought about the concept of sovereign immunity. Maverick had claimed it for himself. But true sovereignty is not a claim. It is an ownership. Her grandfather had understood that the greatest power in the modern world is the power to be invisible. He had spent his life ensuring that the Black estate was the foundation that others built upon, without realizing it was there. Symphony adjusted her grip on the bone-carved queen. She thought about the weight of the litigation that was now raining down on Maverick's holding companies in every major port city. Lawyers were filing maritime liens in every global bank. Asset seizure notices were being triggered by the loss of his city's sovereign status. The Aegis was no longer a nation. It was a liability, and Maverick Hunt was the primary debtor. Symphony leaned back, the leather of her chair creaking softly in the silent bridge. She thought about the scent of the sea air she had smelled when she was thrown into the lifeboat. She remembered the salt, the cold, the raw reality of the water. Maverick had tried to hide from that reality behind glass and steel. He had tried to build a world where he was the only one with the map. Now, Symphony had taken the map away. She watched as the emergency sirens began to wail inside the dark atrium. It was a thin, pathetic sound. It was the sound of a city realizing it was lost at sea. The elite guests were huddled together. Their expensive smartphones were useless. No signals, no bars, no escape. They were trapped in a dark tomb of $5 billion. Symphony spoke to the dark bridge. Her voice was a low, velvety shadow. She told Maverick that the world had forgotten him. She told him that he was now just a coordinate, and she was the only one who knew the numbers. She signaled the engineers of the Obsidian to maintain the blackout envelope. Oh, no signals were to leave. No signals were to enter. She was the architect of the void. She was the master of the silence. She rolled the bone. Queen, one last time. It made a sharp, decisive sound as it settled in her palm. The digital deletion was complete. The Aegis was an island of ghosts, and Symphony Black was the one. Who owned the silence? She watched Maverick through the screen. He was leaning against the cold marble railing, his head in his hands. He looked small. He looked fragile. The institutional justice machine had finished its primary work. There was no need for violence. The law and the code had done what 1,000 soldiers could not. They had turned a king into a trespasser. They had turned a city into a wreckage. Symphony. Black felt the cold, perfect stillness of her ship. She was the sovereign of the deep. And the deep was now the only world. Maverick Hunt had left. She watched as the first heavy rain of the storm began to wash the gold leave from the exterior of the Aegis. The city was starting to look like what it truly was, a debt that could never be paid. Symphony closed her eyes, listening to the rhythmic ping of her sonar. It was the heartbeat of the ocean, and the ocean always collects what? The Atlantic had become a graveyard of ambition. The Aegis was no longer a floating city. It was a massive, dead weight. It sat low in the churning water, a silent tomb of glass and steel. $5 billion of technology had been reduced to a dark, cold silhouette against an unforgiving horizon. Inside the grand atrium, the temperature was falling. The air was no longer scrubbed and perfect. It was becoming heavy with the scent of the raw, non-negotiable sea. Maverick Hunt sat on the cold marble of the mezzanine. His crushed velvet suit was wrinkled. His hair was disheveled. He looked like a king who had realized his crown was made of salt. The silence was absolute. It was the kind of silence that precedes a landslide. Maverick looked out into the fog. It was a thick, gray wall of vapor that seemed to have swallowed the entire world. There were no stars, no moon, only the rhythmic, terrifying slap of waves against the dead hull of his dream. Then something shifted. It was not a sound. It was a pressure. The fog did not just move. It parted. Emerging from the gray veil was a shape so dark it seemed to be a hole in reality. It was the Obsidian. It moved without a wake, without the thrum of engines. It was a stealth predator of the deep, a sleek, matte black ghost ship that absorbed what little light was left in the world. Symphony Black stood on the bridge of the Obsidian. She was a statue of obsidian and silver. Her skin was a deep blue-black that reflected the cool, indigo glow of the silent command monitors. Her silver-gray buzz cut was a sharp, precision-engineered crown. The wave pattern on her temple seemed to vibrate with the intensity of her focus. She rolled the antique bone-carved chess queen between her fingers. The cool, hard surface of the bone was her only anchor. To the world, it was a game piece. To Symphony, it was the physical embodiment of a legal foreclosure. Her internal monologue was a cold, High-speed calculation. She was not thinking about the man on the mezzanine. She was thinking about the notice of default. That was being broadcast through every Maritime satellite on the planet. She was thinking about the sovereign deed that gave her the right to reclaim the seabed and everything attached to it. Maverick Hunt scrambled to his feet. He pressed his face against the cold glass of the observation deck. He watched as the matte black hull of the Obsidian pulled alongside the Aegis. The contrast was devastating. The Aegis was a brightly colored, dying toy. The Obsidian was a silent, living weapon. There were no lights on Symphony's ship. No friendly signals. It was a void of authority. The two vessels did not touch. They drifted together in a terrifying, magnetic dance. Symphony stepped toward the bridge window. She adjusted her grip on the Bone Queen. The light from the Aegis emergency flares caught the silver of her hair. She looked at the city Maverick had built. It was a monument to the belief that wealth could delete the law. Symphony knew better. She knew that wealth is a vapor, but land, even land miles beneath the water, is eternal. She thought about the concept of adverse possession. By anchoring into her mineral reserve, Maverick had legally granted her a stake in his infrastructure now. Because his city was no longer functional, it fell under the salvage and maritime liability protocols. In simple terms, the Aegis was now a derelict, and Symphony Black was the primary salver. She signaled her team. The magnetic mooring clamps engaged. A massive metallic boom echoed through the grand atrium. It was the sound of the trap closing. Maverick Hunt felt the vibration in his teeth. He watched as the black ship tethered itself to his city. He realized that this was not a rescue. This was a boarding. Symphony walked toward the airlock. Her movements were fluid, like a predator moving through the tall grass. She felt the heavy weight of the Bone Queen in her palm. She thought about her grandfather. He had taught her that the deep ocean is the ultimate courtroom. There are no judges there, only the reality of the map she was about to serve Maverick Hunt with the reality of his own map. She felt the airlock hiss open. The scent of the raw Atlantic hit her face. It was cold, brutal, honest. She stepped out onto the boarding ramp. High above her, the elite guests of the Aegis were watching from the dark balconies. They saw the silver-gray flash of her hair. They saw the blue-black authority of her presence. They didn't see a woman. They saw the law. Symphony walked across the bridge that now connected the two worlds. Her heels made a sharp, decisive sound on the matte black metal. She was entering the city he had built to escape her. Maverick Hunt was waiting at the inner hatch. He was shivering. His velvet suit was no longer a shield. It was a costume. He looked at Symphony. His eyes were wide, bloodshot. He tried to speak. He tried to reclaim his voice. Symphony did not wait for him. She held up the antique, bone-carved chess queen. She told him that his independence was a fantasy. She told him that he was standing on her floor. In her house, Maverick's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Symphony felt a cold, analytical satisfaction. This was the moment of institutional justice. She was not here to argue. She was here to repossess. She thought about the fiduciary duty she owed to the Black estate. She thought about the centuries of planning that had led to this exact moment. The silence on the Aegis was now the silence of a grave. Symphony walked past Maverick. She didn't even look at him. He was a non-entity, a ghost in her new hallway. She headed toward the server room, toward the heart of the city. She knew that once she touched the servers, the digital asset seizure would be complete. The world would realize that the data haven Maverick had promised was now her property. The secrets of the elite were now the leverage of the Black estate. She felt the pulse in her, thumb steady, low. She rolled the Bone Queen across her knuckles. The return was complete. The architect had arrived, and the king was now just a tenant who couldn't pay the rent. Symphony reached the heavy titanium door of the server room. She looked at the reflection of her silver hair in the polished metal. She was the sovereign of the deep, and the deep always takes back what it owns. Maverick Hunt followed her. His voice was a thin, pathetic whisper. He asked her what she was doing. Symphony didn't turn around. She told him that she was balancing the books. She told him that in 12 hours, this city would be registered as a subsidiary of the Black Trust, and he would be registered as an unauthorized passenger. She felt the door of the server room unlock as she approached. Her sovereign key had already bypassed his security. She stepped into the dark, humming room. The institutional justice machine was now in the final phase of asset integration. There was no escape. There were no lawyers who could fight a Maritime. Symphony Black was the law, and the law was now the owner of the skyline. She watched as the first data streams began to transfer to the obsidian. The secrets of the world were flowing through her fingers. She rolled the Bone Queen one last time. It made a sharp, decisive click against her signet ring. The return was absolute. The city was dark, but Symphony Black was the light that was coming to take it all away. The heart of the Aegis was a chamber of cooling titanium and dying dreams. The server room hummed with a low, mournful frequency. It was the sound of a $5 billion machine realizing it no longer had a purpose. The air was chilled, dry. It smelled of static electricity and the faint, bitter scent of scorched insulation. Symphony Black stood in the center of the dark, flickering room. She was a vision of absolute authority. Her deep, blue-black skin seemed to absorb the emergency red lights, turning her into a shadow that commanded the space. Her silver-gray buzzcut was a sharp, metallic crown under the strobing sensors. The wave pattern on her temple was a silent, precise reminder of the tides she controlled. Between her fingers, she rolled the antique bone-carved chess queen. The ivory was cold. It felt like a piece of the earth itself. This was not just a signature item. It was the physical anchor of the Black Estate. Maverick Hunt stood by the primary terminal. His hands were shaking. He was tapping at a keyboard that no longer recognized his biometrics. His velvet suit was a ruin, a costume from a play that had already ended. He looked at Symphony with a mixture of terror and a desperate, fragile hope. He asked her why she was doing this. He told her the world needed the Aegis. He claimed his city was the future of energy, the future of data. Symphony stopped moving the chess queen. She let it rest in the center of her palm. The light caught the intricate carvings on the queen's crown. She looked at Maverick. Her amber eyes were cold. They were the eyes of a strategist who had seen the end of the game before the first move was made. She told him that his vision was not a future. It was a theft. She stepped toward the central holographic display. With a flick of her wrist, she synchronized the bone-carved queen with the terminal's near-field sensor. The room did not just light up. It ignited. A massive, three-dimensional map of the mid-Atlantic ridge bloomed in the dark. It was a landscape of jagged peaks and deep, silent trenches. At the center of the map was a pulsing, golden vein. It looked like a river of liquid sun buried miles beneath the silt. Symphony pointed to the vein. Her voice was a low, resonant velvet that filled the chamber. She told Maverick that he was a tech giant who forgot to check the ground. She revealed the truth. The Aegis was not just anchored in the middle of the ocean. It was anchored directly over the world's largest untapped lithium deposit. Maverick's breath caught. He stared at the golden vein on the map. He was a man who built batteries. He was a man who controlled the global supply chain for electric transit. He knew exactly what that deposit represented. It was the heart of the 21st century. It was worth more than the 10 largest companies in the world combined. But then, Symphony changed the display. A digital deed scrolled across the screen. It was an ancient, encrypted document. It bore the seal of the 1954 Seabed Mining Treaty. It bore the signature of her grandfather. She told him that the sea may be international, but the minerals are private. Under the sovereign deed protocols, the Black Estate held the exclusive extraction and mooring rights to this specific coordinate. Maverick Hunt had built his city on the one piece of the planet he could never buy: symphonies. Internal monologue was a cold, high-speed calculation. She was thinking about the concept of fiduciary duty. She was thinking about the institutional justice that comes when the arrogant realize they are just tenants. Maverick tried to laugh. It was a thin, brittle sound. He told her it didn't matter. He said he had the Navy. He said he had the world's elite on board. He said no one would let her take the lithium. Symphony did not smile. She simply tilted her head. She told him that she didn't want the lithium. She already owned it. What she wanted was the trespass fee in maritime law, specifically under the doctrine of encroachment. The penalty for unauthorized mining or mooring on a protected mineral reserve is the total forfeiture of the encroaching assets. Symphony had not come to the Aegis to talk. She had come to perform a digital foreclosure. Because Maverick City was powered by the very thermal vents connected to her lithium vein, he was technically stealing property every second the city was operational. She had already filed the cease and desist with every global regulatory body. The moment the city grounded, the ownership of the Aegis legally transferred to the Black Trust. Maverick Hunt was not a king. He was a squatter in a $5 billion house. Symphony rolled the Bone Queen back into her pocket. She felt the weight of the wind. It was a heavy, satisfying gravity. She thought about the elite guests in the atrium. They were not her concern. They were just cargo now. She was thinking about the lithium monopoly that was now shifting from the Silicon Valley boardrooms to her matte black bridge on the Obsidian. Maverick slumped against the terminal. He looked at the map. He saw the golden vein. He saw the red line of the foreclosure notice. He realized he had spent his entire life building a cage for himself. Symphony walked toward the exit. Her heels made a sharp, decisive sound on the titanium floor. She told him that the rent was no longer negotiable. She told him that by sunrise, the flags of the Aegis would be replaced by the emblem of the Black State. She was the architect of the new world. She was the sovereign of the deep. She felt the cold, perfect stillness of the server room. The legal strike was complete. It was cold. It was legal. It was absolute. There were no physical fights, no shouting, just the sound of a bill being presented to a man who thought he was a god. Symphony reached the door. She looked back at Maverick one last time. He was just a silhouette against the glowing map of the lithium he would never touch. She told the room to go dark. The holographic map vanished. The institutional justice machine had finished the execution. The city was dark, but Symphony Black was the owner of the future. She walked out into the hallway, heading back toward the boarding ramp. The salt air was waiting for her. The law of the deep was satisfied, and Maverick Hunt was now just a memory in a dead city. The command deck of the Aegis was no longer a palace of silicon and light. It was a cold, hollow metal tomb. The only light came from the emergency red strobes that pulsed like a dying heart. Every pulse cast long, distorted shadows of Maverick Hunt against the gold-leafed walls. The air was becoming thin, bitter with the scent of stagnant ozone and the metallic temps of fear. Maverick leaned against the primary console. His hands were pale, gripping the cold titanium edge until his knuckles turned white. He looked at the holographic map of the lithium vein below them. It was a river of fire in a world of ice. To him, it was the ultimate prize. To the woman standing across from him, it was a trap. Symphony Black moved through the darkness like a shadow that had learned how to breathe. Her deep, blue-black skin absorbed the red light of the strobes, giving her an aura of terrifying, silent authority. Her silver-gray buzz cut was a sharp, precise crown. The shaved wave pattern on her temple seemed to ripple with every shift of her head. She looked like the physical manifestation of the deep Atlantic, ancient, unforgiving, absolute between her long, elegant fingers. She rolled the antique bone-carved chess queen, the sound of the bone clicking against. Her signet ring was the only rhythm in the room. It was a heavy, Decisive sound. It was the sound of a clock reaching midnight. Symphony felt the weight of the queen. It was not just a piece of ivory. It was a sovereign key. It contained the encrypted coordinates of a legal history that Maverick Hunt had tried to delete with his wealth. Symphony looked at him. Her amber eyes were cold, analytical. She was not seeing a man. She was seeing a technicality. Maverick tried to reclaim his voice. It was a thin, brittle sound. He told her that he had the best lawyers in London. He told her that international waters meant total immunity. He claimed that his anchors were just tools of stability. Symphony stopped rolling the queen. She let it rest in the center of her palm. The light caught the intricate, worn carvings of the crown. She spoke. Her voice was a low, resonant velvet that seemed to vibrate in the very metal of the floor. She told him that immunity is for guests. Sovereignty is for owners. She walked toward the holographic display. Her movement was fluid, effortless. She pointed to the spot where Maverick's massive steel anchors had pierced the seabed silt dot. She told him that he had made a fatal error in his definition of space. He thought he was a sailor, but by dropping those anchors into a protected mineral reserve, he had become a minor dot. She informed him that under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, specifically Article 101, the unauthorized extraction or intent to extract minerals from a sovereign deeded floor is not a civil trespass. It is a maritime act of piracy. Maverick's face went gray. He tried to protest. He said he hadn't extracted a single gram of lithium. Symphony tilted her head. The silver of her hair flashed in the red light. She told him that the intent to convert was established the moment he grounded his city and connected his thermal intake valves to the subsurface heat of the lithium vein. In the eyes of the Global Maritime Tribunal, the Aegis was no longer a city. It was a high-tech drill. By anchoring there without a lease from the Black Estate, he had committed attempted mineral theft on a strategic global resource. But she wasn't finished. Symphony stepped closer. Her presence was overwhelming. A cold, blue-black wall of institutional justice. She told him that lithium is a Duluth mineral. It is classified under the Strategic Global Defense Protocols as a sovereign defense asset by attempting to seize control of the world's largest deposit through illegal mooring. Maverick had not just broken a trade law, he had committed a maritime act of war. The silence that followed was heavy. Absolute. Maverick slumped back against the console. The reality was crashing down on him like a tidal wave. He wasn't just losing his money. He was being classified as a hostis humani generis, an enemy of all mankind. Symphony's internal monologue was a cold, satisfied calculation. She thought about the fiduciary duty she had to protect the legacy of her grandfather. He had seen this coming 70 years ago. He had known that men like Maverick would eventually try to run away from the law and into the deep dot. He had built the trap. Symphony was just the one who sprung it. She thought about the elite guests huddled in the dark atrium below. They were now the unwilling passengers of a pirate vessel. Their assets were being frozen in real time. Their reputations were being liquidated by association. This was not a physical battle. It was a systemic execution, Maverick whispered. He asked her what she wanted. He offered her half the city. He offered her $10 billion in untraceable crypto. Symphony did not even blink. She told him that you cannot buy the ocean from the woman who owns the floor. She rolled the bone-carved queen back across her knuckles. The click was final. She told him that as of 5 minutes ago, the Obsidian had broadcast a global piracy alert to every naval command in the Atlantic. The Aegis was now a blacklisted asset. Any ship that attempted to assist him would be classified as an accomplice to mineral theft. Maverick looked out at the dark horizon. He realized he was truly alone. His satellite links were dead. His GPS was a ghost. His wealth was a series of numbers in banks that were currently receiving asset seizure notices from the Black Trust. He was a king who had built his castle on a landmine. Symphony turned toward the airlock. Her heels made a sharp, decisive sound on the titanium grating. She told him that the Navy would be here by dawn. She told him that she wouldn't be here to see them take him. She had already achieved her objective. The Black estate had just legally repossessed a $5 billion infrastructure. The Aegis was no longer his. It was a security forfeiture for the attempted theft of the lithium vein. Symphony felt the cold, perfect stillness of her heart. This was the peak of institutional justice. She had not used a single weapon. She had used a deed, a treaty, and a bone-carved chess piece. She walked out of the command deck, her silver-gray buzz cut, disappearing into the shadows of the hallway. She was the sovereign of the deep, and the deep was now a prison for the arrogant Maverick. Hunt stood in the red dark, surrounded by the hum of machines that belonged to another woman. He touched his velvet suit. It felt like a shroud. The act of piracy was complete. The act of war had been won, without a single shot. Symphony Black walked back across the boarding ramp toward the Obsidian. The salt air hit her face, cold, honest. She rolled the Bone Queen one last time. The future was blue-black, and it was hers. Symphony Black sat in the absolute silence of the bridge of the Obsidian. The indigo light of the primary monitors reflected off her deep, blue-black skin. It gave her the appearance of a shadow given form, a predator carved from the very night she now controlled. Her silver-gray buzz cut was a sharp, metallic crown. The precision-shaved wave pattern on her temple shimmered as she tilted her head. The air in the bridge was cold. 64 degrees. It was the temperature of total, unflinching calculation. It smelled of ozone, of cold steel, of the silent, weighty power of the deep Atlantic. Between her fingers, Symphony rolled the antique bone-carved chess. Quinn. The ivory was aged, smooth. It carried the microscopic scratches of a century of strategic maneuvers. To Maverick Hunt, this was a trinket. To the Maritime courts, this was the sovereign key. It held the encrypted access to the 1954 seabed. Mining Trust. Symphony looked at the massive silhouette of the Aegis on her infrared display. The $5 billion city was no longer a golden beacon. It was a cold, dying beast. Its heat signature was fading as the primary systems failed. It was grounded. It was blacked out. It was legally dead. But for Symphony, the job was not finished. Repossession requires total, uninterrupted isolation. She touched the glass of the primary console. Her movements were fluid, like a current moving through the dark. She was not acting out of anger. She was acting out of fiduciary duty. She gave the command. Activate the safety zone protocol on the display. A red circle began to expand from the center of the Obsidian. It grew until it swallowed the Aegis. Symphony's ship was no longer just a vessel. It was now a localized jamming station under the International Maritime Organization's Sovereign Exclusion Guidelines. The owner of a private mineral reserve has the right to establish a 500-meter safety zone around any installation making contact with the seabed by locking Maverick's anchors. Symphony had physically merged his city with her land. This gave her the legal authority to seize the airspace. The radio waves. She signaled her tactical engineers. They were shadows in the dark bridge, working with a silent, professional precision. They activated the localized jammer. The effect on the Aegis was immediate and absolute. Inside the Grand Atrium, Maverick Hunt was trying to use a satellite phone he had pulled from an emergency locker. He was screaming into the receiver, demanding a rescue, demanding a Navy. Suddenly, the line went from a faint static to a heavy, physical silence. The signal bars on his phone vanished. Every screen on every device in the city turned to terminal. Flat gray. The Aegis was now a digital vacuum. Symphony watched the data streams on her monitor. She saw the frantic pulses of outgoing signals hitting her wall and being absorbed. She saw the attempts to reach the cloud, to reach the Coast Guard. To reach the world, none of them made it past her hall. She rolled the bone-carved queen across her knuckles. The click was a sharp, decisive punctuation in the silence. She thought about Maverick's arrogance. He had believed that the gray zones of the ocean would protect him. He thought that by floating, he was beyond the reach of the law. He didn't realize that the law lives in the foundations. Symphony felt a cold, analytical satisfaction. This was the moment of total isolation. She was not just cutting his wires. She was deleting his reality in the eyes of the world's tracking systems. The Aegis had already vanished. Now, even the physical space around the city belonged to her. She informed the bridge crew to monitor all proximity sensors. No ship was to enter. No boat was to leave Dot if a rescue vessel arrived. They would find a safety zone lockdown active. They would be greeted by a legal broadcast from the Black estate informing them that any entry was a violation of sovereign territory. Maverick Hunt was a prisoner in his own kingdom. Symphony leaned forward. Her amber eyes were cold. They were the eyes of a strategist who had already seen the final move. She looked at the bone-carved queen. She thought about her grandfather. He had taught her that power is not about who has the biggest gun. It is about who owns the gate. Symphony Black was the gate. The internal monologue in her mind was a symphony of maritime litigation. She was calculating the exact moment. She would allow the Navy to arrive. She wanted the elite guests on board to feel the full weight of the isolation. She wanted them to realize that their gold, their connections, their status, it all meant nothing in the face of a sovereign deed. She wanted Maverick to feel the walls closing in. She watched as Maverick ran to the edge of the mezzanine. He was looking at the matte black hull of the Obsidian. He was waving his arms. It's a tiny, pathetic figure against the backdrop of a dying city. Symphony did not move. She did not blink. Dot. She told the bridge to increase the jamming frequency. Dot. She wanted the silence to be so loud that Maverick could hear his own heart beating. The institutional justice machine was now in the penultimate phase. The asset was seized. The owner was served. The area was isolated. There was no escape. There were no loopholes. Maverick Hunt was standing on a $5 billion wreckage. And he couldn't even call a taxi. Symphony felt the cold, perfect stillness of her heart. This was the beauty of the sovereign move. It was cold. It was legal. It was absolute. She thought about the maritime act of piracy she had already logged. By the time the jamming was lifted, Maverick would not be facing a lawsuit. He would be facing a tribunal. She rolled the bone queen one last time. It made a sharp, decisive sound as it settled in her palm. The isolation was complete. The Aegis was an island of ghosts, and Symphony Black was the one who controlled the fog. She watched the red circle on the monitor. It was a perfect, unbroken boundary. Maverick was legally and physically contained. The world outside was moving on. Global markets were already reacting to the default of Hunt Industries. Stock prices were plummeting. Board members were resigning. Maverick Hunt was being erased from the economy while he stood in the dark. Symphony touched the wave pattern on her temple. A gesture of cold. Final focus. She told the bridge that the countdown to the final surrender was at 90 minutes. She would wait. She was a woman of infinite patience. She knew that by the time the sun rose, Maverick Hunt would be begging for the very laws he had tried to escape. She sat in the indigo light, a shadow of authority. The deep Atlantic was her courtroom, and the verdict had already been reached. The isolation was the final lesson. You can build a city on the water, but you can never escape the floor. Symphony Black closed her eyes, listening to the rhythmic, low-frequency thrum of her jammer. It was the sound of a kingdom being dismantled. It was the sound of justice, the darkness inside the grand atrium of the Aegis was no longer just an absence of light. It was a physical weight. It felt like the pressure of 5 miles of ocean water pressing against the glass. The air was cold, stagnant. It carried the bitter scent of copper and the raw, primal smell of fear from the hundreds of elite guests huddling in the shadows. Their perfumes and expensive colognes had long since faded, leaving only the smell of a kingdom that was rotting from the inside out. Maverick Hunt sat on the floor of the mezzanine, his back against a marble pillar that was now as cold as a headstone. His velvet suit was a tattered shroud. He was shivering, not just from the drop in temperature, but from the realization that his name no longer carried any weight. In the world above the waves, he was alone in a $5 billion cage. Suddenly, the heavy titanium doors hissed. Open. It was not the sound of a rescue team. It was the sound of a verdict. Symphony Black stepped into the atrium. She was a vision of absolute, unyielding authority. Her deep, blue-black skin seemed to absorb what little light was left in the room, making her look like a goddess of the abyss. Her silver-gray buzz cut caught the flicker of a single emergency strobe, shimmering like a blade. The wave pattern on her temple was a silent reminder of the currents she had mastered to destroy him. Between her fingers, she rolled the antique bone-carved chess queen. The sound of the bone clicking against her platinum signet ring was the only rhythm in the dead city. It was a heavy, decisive sound. It was the sound of a heart beating in a world that had stopped. Symphony felt the cool texture of the bone. She felt the micro-engravings of the sovereign deeds. She was not a woman seeking a fight. She was a strategist completing a ledger. She walked toward Maverick. Her heels made a sharp, echoing sound on the marble. Maverick looked up. His eyes were bloodshot, hollow. He tried to speak, but his voice was a dry, pathetic rasp. He asked her if she was there to kill him. Symphony stopped 5 feet away. She looked down at him, not with hatred, but with the clinical detachment of an architect looking at a structural failure. She told him that death is a messy exit. She told him that she preferred a more systemic conclusion. She tapped her tablet. A single glowing document appeared in the air between them. A digital transfer of sovereign title. She told him that his time as a king was over. She revealed the final weight of his situation. The international maritime piracy charges had already been processed. The global naval commands were less than an hour away. Because he had anchored in a strategic lithium reserve without a lease, he was being classified as a hostis humani generis, an enemy of the human race. If he stayed on this ship as its owner, he would be taken in chains. He would spend the rest of his life in a military brig, without a phone, without a lawyer, without a screen. He would be legally deleted. Maverick's breath hitched. He looked at the document. He looked at the transfer of title to the Black estate. He asked her what happened if he signed. Symphony leaned in. The scent of salt and ancient wisdom followed her. She told him that if he signed, he would be classified as a passenger on a vessel owned by the Black estate. He would be a guest of the sovereign. She would provide him with safe passage to a neutral port. He would be a pauper, but he would be a free man. Maverick looked out at the dark horizon. He saw the first faint line of gray light appearing on the edge of the world. The sun was coming, and with it, the end of his life as he knew it. He looked at his city, his dream. It was just a dark shadow on her floor. Symphony rolled the bone-carved queen one last time. It made a sharp, final click. She told him that the ocean does not negotiate, and neither does she. She gave him 10 seconds. Maverick Hunt broke. With a trembling hand, he reached out and touched the glowing tablet. He traced his signature across the digital glass. The moment the signature was verified, the world changed. The lights in the grand atrium did not just flicker. They surged. The golden chandeliers ignited with a brilliant, warm glow. The climate control hummed back to life, sending a wave of warm, cedar-scented air through the room. The data servers in the bowels of the ship began to sing a new, harmonious tune, but the screens did not show the face of Maverick Hunt. They showed the emblem of the Black estate. Symphony Black stood in the center of the light. She was the master of the sunrise. She looked at her watch. The countdown was over. She signaled the Obsidian. The stealth vessel pulled away from the city, its mission complete. Symphony walked toward the observation deck. She didn't look back at Maverick. He was already a ghost, a fragment of a past that no longer mattered. She stood at the glass, watching the sun rise over the Atlantic. The water was a field of liquid gold dot. She thought about her grandfather. She thought about the fiduciary duty she had fulfilled. The lithium deposit was safe. The infrastructure was hers. The institutional justice was absolute. She felt the heavy weight of the bone-carved queen in her palm. It felt warmer now. It felt satisfied. The Aegis was no longer a lawless city. It was a sovereign colony of the Black Trust. Symphony adjusted her silver buzz cut. She felt the cool, fresh air of the new day. Her internal monologue was a symphony of reconstruction. She was already planning the new protocols, the new laws, the new order, she told the air and the ocean. That the books were finally balanced. The Matriarch's will had been served. She watched as a small supply boat arrived from the Obsidian to take Maverick Hunt away. He was led down the ramp, silent, broken. A man who had tried to own the world and ended up owning nothing but his own breath. Symphony Black remained. On the bridge, she was the sovereign of the deep dot. She was the architect of the future. She looked out at her new kingdom. The deep Atlantic was no longer a gray zone. It was her legacy. She rolled the Bone Queen across her knuckles. One last time, the click was the final sound of the story. It was the sound of a queen taking her throne. The sun hit the wave pattern on her temple, making it glow like a silver crown. The world was quiet, the world was just, and the deep was finally at peace.